I forgot. I gotta reset all this shit up. Oh god, what a pain in the ass. This is peak 99 gaming. We killed each other? Really?
Sold something while you were gone. What have you got for me?
What do you need?
Those filthy opportunists will run you through! Deaths crush you! Be washed away! Face the wrath of the sea! always goes down with this ship.
Interesting stuff. What do you need? They're on their way. They're on their way.
Come on, what have you got? Let's make some dust.
They've brought back some things from the Atlas.
what you need.
Ahoy there.
I think I could sell that.
was allowed some freedom of movement to continue his studies. So he traveled up and down the Anatolian coast, where he sought out the great masters of philosophy and rhetoric and even magic. It was at this point, round about 351 or 352 AD, that Julian turned decisively away from Christianity. Now, there was no real dramatic moment of conversion where Julian lights a bundle of scripture on fire and declares himself the enemy of Christianity for all time. It was just that during this period, the scales of belief tipped away from Christianity and towards paganism. Julian knew Christian scripture backward and forward, and had always been troubled by its many contradictions, and so now he embraced an alternative theology. The classical philosophy he read and the pagan cults he encountered were exciting, and most likely they simply offered Julian a more satisfying explanation of the cosmos than he found in Christian teachings. I should note, though, that a few armchair psychologists have argued that Julian's rejection of Christianity may have stemmed from the fact that his devoutly Christian cousin Constantius had, murdered his entire family. But I think that's unnecessary. I just think Julian was a whip-smart 20-year-old who turned his back on the traditional religion of his family in order to pursue more exotic belief systems. Things like this happen literally every single day. So I don't think we need to bring the trauma of his childhood in to explain why Julian ultimately turned his back on Christianity forever. I have to imagine that the years in between Gallus's rise and Gallus's fall had to have been the happiest of Julian's life. He was young, mostly free to come and go as he pleased, and he was surrounded by exciting new ideas. For a reserved intellectual like Julian, this had to have been something close to heaven, enjoying the perks of his imperial connections without any of the political or military entanglements. However, when the Gallus affair climaxed with the execution of his brother, the idyllic life of Julian ended, and something far more complicated took its place. As the last remaining male relative of Constantius, he was called to Milan shortly after his brother's death in late 354, so that the emperor could size him up. Figure out if he was dangerous, first of all, and then figure out if maybe Julian could handle the job of Caesar, should the need arise. After his arrival in the Italian capital, though, he was kept under a sort of house arrest. He wasn't allowed to leave, but neither was he ever summoned to meet with Constantius. So, is he going to kill me like the rest of my family? Is he going to let me go? Like, what's the deal here? This limbo persisted a good 7 months, and it was not until mid-355 that Constantius finally decided to have a look at the boy. Julian had done his best to adopt a non-threatening posture throughout his life, and after meeting with the emperor, Julian was relieved to discover that this posture had shown through. His confinement in Milan did not in fact turn out to be him just sitting on death row. Constantius decided to let his cousin leave Italy to continue his education. His life having just flashed before his eyes, though, Julian took this opportunity to visit the only city a burgeoning young intellectual absolutely must visit before they die: Athens. He received permission to travel to the ancient city and departed at once. Eager to take in everything that Athens had to offer, he studied at the feet of the Greek masters and was inducted into the Eleusinian mysteries. But at the end of autumn 355, just 3 months after arriving, Julian learned that his days as a professional student were about to come to an end. Or maybe Constantius had reconsidered, and it was his life that was about to come to an end. Julian, reluctantly, and most likely fearfully, returned to Milan. As I'm sure you can probably guess, though, Constantius had not called Julian back to Milan to kill him. No, he had a far worse fate in store for the cerebral 23-year-old. On November 6, 355 AD, Constantius assembled the troops and announced that he was making Julian his Caesar. The troops cheered, Julian cringed, and the empire had itself a new junior emperor. And what would the new junior emperor's assignment be? How about ridding all Gaul of its German invaders and returning peace and security to the western provinces? Think you can handle that? This throw him in the deep end and see if he can swim mentality has been taken by some to indicate that Constantius didn't really care if Julian sank or swam. If the kid pulls it off, then great, The Empire is that much better for it. But if it turns out he's in over his head and gets killed in the fighting, well, that takes care of a dynastic threat I'll probably just get all paranoid about in a few years anyway. In other words, sending Julian north was win-win, at least from Constantius' point of view. As Julian left for Gaul, I can very much picture the bookmakers of the Empire taking odds as to whether the young Caesar was going to come back alive. He had no military experience and no political experience. So, if the Germans didn't stab him in the front, then surely some cutthroat advisor is going to stab him in the back. Just look at what had happened to his brother. When the new Caesar arrived in Gaul in his ill-fitting military attire and accompanied by an entourage whose loyalty first and foremost was to Constantius, no one figured that he stood a chance. But to everyone's surprise, Julian decided not to mess around with this thing. If he was going to be Caesar, then doggone it, he was going to be Caesar. Much as I'm sure part of him wanted to sit in his tent reading books while other men took care of his business for him, Julian refused to fall into that trap. The parallels to Marcus Aurelius on this point are interesting, and I often think that in Julian we get a chance to see what a 20-something-year-old Marcus would have been like as an emperor had not Antoninus Pius inexplicably reigned for like 150 years. Both men were much more inclined temperamentally to intellectual pursuits, but, forced into action, both refused to shirk their duty, and they took seriously their role as a military leader. It speaks well of both of them. Over that winter of 355-356, Julian threw himself into the soldier's life, commandeering a drill sergeant and forcing himself to do everything a new recruit would be expected to do. The senior officials surrounding the young leader, military and political alike, were surprised at his dedication, but still, they probably were snickering behind his back. This pampered prince was no soldier. Who did he think he was kidding? At the end of this no doubt stirring montage, though, Julian was in shape and ready for action. He had no intention of sitting on the sidelines or being a mere figurehead. He was going to lead the legions into battle. If people didn't think he was up to it, well, he was just going to have to prove them wrong. The only question left was where to start. As I touched on last week, the revolt and subsequent defeat of Magnentius had left the Rhine defenses in shambles. Cities were under garrison, watchtowers were left unmanned, and the general focus of everyone had been on the internal threat of Constantius rather than the external threat of the Alemanni and the Franks. The Germans picked up on this pretty quickly, and in the 5 years since Magnentius had donned his purple cloak, the Romans had been pushed back off the Rhine River, losing control of a good number of cities in the process, including Cologne, the capital of Germania Inferior. So Julian's first task was clear: march to the lower Rhine and retake the lost urban centers along the river. For all of 356, Julian campaigned against the Germans and emerged victorious from a series of decently sized encounters. As winter approached, Julian had succeeded in driving off the occupying Germans and retaking, among other cities, the great military capital of Cologne. It was a fantastic start to his career, though I would be negligent in my duties if I didn't point out that defending walled cities was not exactly the Germans' forte. They withdrew at the first sign of serious pushback from the Romans. But still, a good first day for the new Caesar. The winter would bring Julian's first taste of real hardship. After scattering his men across Gaul in winter quarters, Julian himself set up shop with a small garrison in the city of Senoum. Julian, confident that the year's campaign had put the Germans on notice, was expecting no trouble. But as soon as he was settled, an army of Franks suddenly appeared at the gates of the city. It was not a large army, but it was bigger than any force Julian could muster right at that moment, so direct counterattack was out of the question. That said, the city's defensive fortifications were sturdy, so it looks like if the Germans want a siege, then a siege is what they are going to get. The Germans apparently had no problem with this, and so a siege is what they got. For the next month, Julian was trapped inside the city, unable to break out, but also unwilling to give up. Now, the siege of Sinaun raises a huge question. What in the world was Marcellus doing during all of this? Who was Marcellus, you ask? Well, he was Julian's master of the horse, who was stationed just 100 miles away with an army big enough to easily drive off the besieging Germans. He knew what was happening, and yet he did nothing. He had his excuses, but really, dude, what is so important that you can't pop down and rescue the freaking Caesar of the empire? Which is exactly what Julian wanted to know after the Germans got tired of the stalemate and withdrew. Marcellus, as I said, has his excuses, but there was absolutely no doubt in Julian's mind that he had been hung out to dry by a disgruntled subordinate, and he wrote to Constantius telling the emperor exactly that and demanding that Marcellus be removed from his post. Marcellus countered by writing a letter of his own, explaining why he had failed to do anything about the siege, but confirming, at least in my own mind, that Marcellus was full of it and had indeed intentionally left Julian hung out to dry. Constantius sided with his Caesar, and Marcellus was banished to the Danube frontier. Once the spring of 357 arrived, Julian was ready to put the winter struggle behind him and go on the offensive. In coordination with his master of the infantry, a general named Barbatio, Julian planned a two-pronged invasion of Alemanni territory along the Upper Rhine. Julian would march due east, while Barbatio, currently in Milan, would march north through Raetia. They would then meet in Alemanni territory and deliver some stern reprisals to the Germans for running amok in Roman territory. But the flying pincer move Julian envisioned fell apart immediately. It started out well enough, but as Julian advanced, a German army crossed the Rhine and attacked the key Gallic city of Lugdunum, forcing Julian to stop and come to the city's aid. Barbatio, meanwhile, was about to prove himself to be either incompetent or sinister, or maybe both. Not only had he allowed the Germans now attacking Lugdunum through the line in the first place, but when they were finally driven off by Julian, Barbatio let them waltz right back through, despite a clear warning from Julian that fugitive barbarians were headed his way and weighed down with captured treasure. As if this wasn't bad enough, a few weeks later, Julian was fighting with the Alemanni and struggling to cross the Rhine, and he requested Barbatio send him 7 boats to help him make the crossing. Barbatio was in the process of building a pontoon bridge of his own, and with more than enough boats at his disposal, Julian figured the master of the infantry could spare him a few. But when he got the request, get this, rather than give Julian 7 boats, Barbatio burned 7 boats, which just doesn't make sense on any level. So then Julian found a fordable spot in the river and managed to drive off the Alemanni he had been facing. But when he looked around for Barbatio, who should be in the area any second now, he discovered that his master of the infantry had been outsmarted and that the Germans had destroyed his pontoon bridge, and so Barbatio was still on the Roman side of the Rhine. Left alone in German territory, Julian prudently fell back. Undeterred, the Caesar set about trying to salvage the campaign, and so he called for additional grain supplies from the south. But rather than allow these grain supplies to pass through, Barbatio, again, get this, burned the carts they were being transported on, claiming that he was afraid the shipments would fall into enemy hands. Then, unilaterally deciding that the year's campaign season was over, Barbatio withdrew back to Milan, leaving Julian exposed to a swarm of stirred-up Germans. So, what exactly was Barbatio's deal? Ammianus Marcellinus, the soldier historian who was serving in the legions at this point, summed it up nicely when he said, "It is unresolved whether he, that is Barbatio, committed so many monstrous acts as a result of his own vanity and self-destructiveness, or prompted by orders of the emperor." Coupled with Marcellus's conduct the previous winter, it does not seem exactly out of the question to wonder if Julian's various commanders had been given explicit instructions by the emperor to undermine his Caesar at every opportunity. But Constantius did want the Germans bottled up, and he had sent Julian to spearhead the operation, So it seems a little weird that he would simultaneously try to trip him up. If he wanted Julian dead, why not just kill him like he had killed everyone else? In all likelihood then, Marcellus, Barbaccio, and the others were simply ticked off about having to take orders from some untested youth playing soldier, and when they saw chances to undermine him, they took them. That, and Barbaccio appears to have been kind of an idiot. But despite their efforts, Julian would not be undermined. Indeed, it was right at this low moment, ditched by Barbaccio and left stranded near Strasbourg with an undersized and ill-supplied army, that Julian won his greatest victory. A German king named Conodamar, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, took the success the Alemanni had been having that year as an opportunity to forge a coalition of 6 tribes and lead them on a massive offensive. As Julian hunkered down with the 13,000 soldiers he had left, reports came in that some 35,000 Alemanni were crossing the Rhine River and heading straight for him. Julian, choosing to force the issue now rather than face battle after a retreat that would likely completely exhaust his already exhausted army, ordered his men forward. Though the Romans were outnumbered, and by Romans I of course mean the Germans fighting for Rome, the discipline that had always been the legion's calling card was still a decisive factor, and at the Battle of Strasbourg, Julian had some of the best troops in the whole empire at his disposal. The turning point in this battle likely came before the first shot was even fired. Always hyper-protective of the egalitarianism that they felt defined them, the German troops demanded that Conodamar and the other chiefs dismount from their horses and fight on foot with everyone else. Bowing to public pressure, the German king complied, but in so doing, he lost his mobility and any sort of ability to run a coherent attack. But then again, with 35,000 fighting 13,000, how coherent does your attack really need to be? Things started out well for the Germans, as they managed to turn back Julian's initial cavalry assault on their left side. Heartened by this success, the middle of the German line surged forward, and the bloody business of raw hand-to-hand fighting commenced. Eventually, the sheer weight of the Germans took its toll, and the German center was cut in 2. Normally, this would be death to an army, but both split wings were able to maintain their order and continue fighting as 2 separate units. Still, things looked pretty dire for Julian and his army, until the Roman back reserve line stepped up to the plate. After the Germans cut through the front line, they ran headlong into a solid wall of highly trained veterans who refused to be pushed back and who refused to be split up. So now, rather than emerging on the far side of a victorious charge with nothing left to do but mop up the fractured Roman army, the German foot soldiers found themselves trapped between the solid back line and the 2 wings of the split front line, who now hemmed them in on either side. If Julian had been able to swing some cavalry around behind them, this all would have resembled nothing so much as the last phase of the Battle of Cannae. So yeah, now things looked pretty dire for the Alemanni. Finally, frustrated and dying by the hundreds, the Germans lost heart and hightailed it out of there. Julian ordered his own army in pursuit, but only to a point. He told his men that when they reached the Rhine, that they were not to get bogged down by climbing into the river. Instead, he ordered them to stay on the banks and just fire spears and arrows at the fleeing Germans. The estimate is that the Alemanni left as many dead in that river as they had on the battlefield. In total, 6,000 Germans died at the Battle of Strasbourg. The Romans, amazingly, lost only 243. The cherry on top of this great victory was when Conodamar was tracked down and brought back in chains. Julian dutifully sent the beaten king on to Milan for Constantius to gloat over. The Battle of Strasbourg cemented Julian's reputation as a leader to be reckoned with. His troops now loved him. Constantius's agents now feared him. And that little tick in the back of the emperor's mind, the one that led him to be super paranoid about everyone and everything, especially threats from within his own family, well, that little tick just got real fired up. Next time, we'll watch all of this come to a head as the relationship between Constantius and Julian will break down completely over an order to transfer Gallic troops to the east to help fight the resurgence of Sonnets. Were the troops really needed, or was this all just about undermining, there's that word again, a Caesar on the rise? I say next time because I hate to do this to you after just being gone for so long, but I'm flying back home for a week of family fun, and I will have absolutely no time to work on the show. But we'll be back in 2 weeks to watch as Julian's troops, surprisingly, and without any prompting from me, I swear, declare Julian Augustus. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 144, The Road to Constantinople. Julian's first taste of what the future had in store for him came immediately after the Battle of Strasbourg in 357 AD. Having just routed a German army that outnumbered them 3-1, and suffering only minimal losses while doing it, the Roman soldiers under Julian's command were understandably exuberant. So exuberant that when Julian emerged to address them following the battle, the troops spontaneously hailed him as Augustus. This seditious offer hung in the air for a heartbeat before the 25-year-old Julian swatted it down harshly. "My cousin Constantius is Augustus," he told them, "and I will not, under any circumstances, allow you to elevate me in opposition to him." This closed the matter for the moment, but after another 2.5 years of rising tensions between Julian and Constantius, the young Caesar would eventually change his mind and allow his army to give him what they wanted to give him. That said, Julian's actions following the victory at Strasbourg went a long way towards convincing the troops that maybe attempting to elevate their Caesar had actually been a bad idea. Sitting right on the line between fall and winter 357, the Roman soldiers assumed that, feather in cap, Julian would order them to a well-deserved winter's rest. But the young general decided instead that now was the best time to drive the Germans into the ground, so he ordered his army across the Rhine. The troops were incredulous. "Are you kidding? We just beat a horde of barbarians in a battle that by all accounts we should have lost, and now you want us to invade Germany in the middle of winter. You must be kidding." He's kidding, right? But Julian was not kidding, and so over the Rhine the legions went. Julian spent the next few months attacking Alemanni settlements and generally running amok. The Germans were just as surprised to see the Roman soldiers coming as the Roman soldiers were to be coming, and they scattered hastily in the face of these unexpected assaults. Though the winter campaign made Julian supremely unpopular, strategically it was a complete success. 3 of the 6 German chiefs who had fought against him at Strasbourg were hunted down and forced to submit to Roman authority. In the middle of January, satisfied that he had made substantial gains in the never-ending war for control of the Rhine River, Julian finally ordered his army back to Gaul. Dispersing his men around the province, Julian himself settled into the city of Lutetia, which, by that point, may already have been known by the name that we know it today, Paris. While wintering in Paris, Julian turned his attention to civil affairs, even though, strictly speaking, they were outside of his jurisdiction. Despite the fact that he held imperial office, as Caesar, Julian was technically only authorized to address the military defense of his provinces. This followed from the precedent established by Diocletian separating military from civilian power, and it meant that while Julian was in Gaul, there was another center of political gravity, the Praetorian prefect Florentius. Florentius was not a bad administrator, But like the other senior officials in Gaul, he resented the arrival of the thoroughly self-confident Julian, especially when Julian began sticking his nose in where it did not belong. After 2 years of uneasy power sharing, the two men finally came to blows over the issue of provincial taxation. Both agreed that it was in everyone's best interest to initiate a rebuilding effort across Gaul for the benefit of the civilian population. Both also agreed that, unfortunately, the current tax receipts were not going to cover the effort. So, more revenue was needed. Florentius wanted to simply throw out a supplemental tax to raise the necessary funds. But Julian dug a little deeper into the issue and came away convinced that what they really needed to do was cut taxes. This counterintuitive idea sprang from two basic facts. First, the people who would be hardest hit by the supplemental tax had already paid everything that they could afford that year. There was no wool left to be sheared. Second, the real problem was not that the tax rate wasn't high enough. It was that the taxes weren't being collected properly. For years, the wealthy landowners of Gaul had been hiding inside of a loophole. Every so often, as a sign of good goodwill or to celebrate something or another, the government would issue a proclamation canceling out unpaid debts to the state. So the rich men of Gaul simply stopped paying their taxes altogether. If government officials got pushy, a helpful bribe would help turn their heads until, inevitably, a proclamation canceling all old debts would be announced and everyone was dropped back down to zero. The poor and middle classes couldn't afford to pay off the officials, so they were left to cover the expenses of the whole provincial administration. Florentius's supplemental tax would simply hit these classes up for more cash, and it was obvious to anyone who cared to pay attention that they really didn't have any more cash to give. So Julian proposed simply cutting taxes across the board and then actually, collecting what everyone owed. This would lead to greater prosperity and more tax revenue for the government. QED. Florentius was annoyed that Julian was even involved with the issue, and really annoyed that Julian was trying to contradict him, and so he immediately wrote to Constantius complaining about the Caesar's conduct. But though Florentius was the emperor's picked man, Constantius decided in this case to side with Julian. Taxes were reduced in Gaul by something like 2/3, and officials stopped allowing the wealthy to defer their payments. The result was a double boon. The lower classes thrived because they had less taxes to pay, and tax revenues increased because the rich were paying their fair share. Not a bad day's policymaking. The success of Julian's proposal was not enough to endear him to Florentius, though, especially because as the summer of 358 arrived, Julian ran another of the prefect's policies off the rails. Since the revolt of Magnentius, the Franks had incrementally increased their power along the northern coast of Gaul, until, by this point, they basically controlled the English Channel. This was, of course, a serious strategic issue for the Romans, as it meant that supply lines from Britannia were not at all secure, which is why Julian had to rely on shipments from the south to feed his army in the north. Florentius's proposal was to just pay the Franks not to attack Roman ships. This straightforward business proposition won Constantius's blessing, but not without a caveat. The emperor wrote to Julian and told the young Caesar to go along with the plan unless he found it, quote, absolutely disgraceful. And to Julian, that's exactly what it was. Without waiting or consulting with anyone, he lined up his troops and marched them north, intent on smashing the Franks and freeing up the grain supply from Britain. It was a risky strategy, especially since feeding his army depended entirely on freeing up those supply lines. But fortune favored his boldness, and after a few weeks on campaign, the Franks were brought to heel, much to Julian's delight and Florentius's chagrin. At the end of this successful operation, though, Julian, standing with his men, once again took a nosedive when they noticed that in his hurry to get the campaign going, all the supplies they had were the supplies they had on their back. When Julian began to order these supplies dispersed to the string of forts he was building to help keep the area secure, his men started to get very angry very quickly. At first, Julian thought the grumbling was just more grumbling, but a hungry army is a dangerous army, and the Caesar was forced to offer a naked bribe to get the men back in line as they waited for a relief shipment of grain. His troops mollified, Julian ordered the army across the Rhine for a second time, and over the course of the rest of the year, he tracked down 2 more of the chiefs who had fought him at Strasbourg and forced them too to sign a non-aggression treaty. As the winter of 358 approached, Julian was able to survey his province with satisfaction. Despite the fact that he had been either subtly undermined or outright opposed by most of the senior officials in Gaul, the young Caesar had succeeded in stabilizing the Rhine frontier, securing control of the English Channel, and generally seeing to it that the citizens of Gaul could prosper once again. It was right around this point, of course, that his relations with Constantius began to fray. Nothing spells imperial paranoia like the popular success of an underling, and as Julian's reputation grew, so too did the scheming of Constantius's court. Just to set the stage for what's coming next, though, we should note that the rising imperial tensions did not occur in a vacuum. While Julian was off subduing Gaul, Constantius stayed mostly in Milan, popping over to the Danube frontier as need be, and once, get this, even paying a visit to Rome, the first such visit of his life. In 357, though, a troubling embassy arrived from the east. Agents of the Sassanid king Shapur had come to demand that Constantius return all territory ceded to the Romans by the Treaty of Nispus some 60 years earlier. The emperor had no intention of coming anywhere close to agreeing to the ambassador's demands, and he sent them packing with a firm no. That being said, the fact that Shapur had even asked meant that the Persian king had likely secured his northern border and was now turning his attention back to his western border. So Constantius sent an embassy of his own back to Shapur, trying to arrange a peace that did not require Rome to just utterly capitulate. This time, it was Shapur's turn to send the embassy packing with a firm no. War was looming once again. As the spring of 359 arrived then, there were two ways that Constantius could look at the success of his younger cousin in Gaul. He could either be happy that the West seemed locked down right at the moment when the East was about to blow up, or he could be unnerved by the fact that just as he was about to be dragged off to fight a war in the East, his younger cousin was becoming immensely popular in the West. With Constantius off fighting, how long would it be until Julian made a grab for power? Unfortunately for everyone, the one person who would act as a check on Constantius's paranoia was his wife Eusebia, and she was now dead. The Augusta had always liked Julian and defended the young Caesar whenever the emperor's advisors ran the boy down. Now that she was dead, everywhere Constantius turned, men were telling him that Julian was a threat, and so the emperor naturally came to believe that Julian was indeed now a threat. While he was growing more and more paranoid about his Caesar, Constantius was knocked sideways by word that in the east, Shapur had begun a siege of the key fortress city of Amida. The emperor dashed east, but along the way learned that after 73 days, Amida had fallen, and with it had gone 6 legions. Upon reaching the east, Constantius discovered the extent of the damage done by Shapur and realized quickly that he did not have enough local manpower to properly defend the border. So in January of 360, he sent a fateful letter to Julian, a letter that would initiate the final break between the two men. Since Gaul was now relatively peaceful and things were falling apart in Syria, Constantius ordered almost half of Julian's Gallic army to march at once to Syria to help shore up the eastern front. Given the circumstances, the order is understandable, but to Julian and his officers, the true reason for the troop redeployment was as plain as day. Julian had gotten too powerful, and Constantius was attempting to neuter him. Neither Julian nor his men knew the full extent of the disaster unfolding in the Far East, and after a year in which relations between Emperor and Caesar had become more and more strained, it was easy for them to jump to the conclusion that something sinister was afoot. Now, I'm not willing to give Constantius a complete pass in all this. Of all the provinces in the empire, he just so happened to demand reinforcements from the one province where the troops were uniformly loyal to Julian. That really does smell like something. But I think that at the end of the day, Julian wound up revolting over a fairly rational military decision. It was probably a non-issue blown way out of proportion. That said, it certainly was not a non-issue to the men of the Gallic legions, especially since Julian had specifically promised them that they would never have to serve beyond the Alps. The army of the late empire was a far more settled force than in previous ages, and all of these men had wives and children and land and interests in Gaul, and they were happy to fight to protect all of that, but they had no interest in being uprooted to go fight in some far-off desert. When news of the order leaked, the soldiers stationed in Paris for the winter immediately demanded to know what Julian was going to do about it, because we are not going to go out and fight Persians. The situation began to quickly spiral out of control as other garrisons heard the news and began to agitate. Julian finally decided that he needed to meet this head-on So he circulated an order for all the troops to leave their quarters and come to Paris so he could address the issue directly. As each garrison arrived, Julian went out to greet them and attempted to win them over with promises of glory and appeals to their patriotic spirit, but yeah, not so much. He then attempted a compromise, announcing that the soldiers would be allowed to bring their families along if they so desired. This kind of addressed their concerns, but not really. Really, they just really didn't want to go. So then, pamphlets began circulating, and rabble-rousers became more brazen, things were getting ugly, and a full-blown mutiny looked like it was right around the corner. The other senior officials in Gaul recognized the powder keg Julian was sitting on, and most, for either personal or professional reasons, decided that the very best thing they could do was stay the hell out of Paris for a while. So, for example, when Julian wrote to Florentius and requested the prefect come to Paris to help him broker a solution, Florentius alternatively ignored the letters or invented paper-thin excuses to remain where he was. There was no love lost between the two men, and it looked like Julian was about to be consumed by a furious army. Why in the world would Florentius want to get in the way of such a delicious ending to this annoying story? But Julian was not going to go down that easy. As I just mentioned, the assumption within his inner circle was that the redeployment order was all about Constantius taking Julian out at the knees, because the emperor was paranoid and jealous of his younger cousin. So Julian was reminded that there was one solution to this problem that he really ought to consider. And in fact, the way things were going, it was really the only solution on the table if he wanted to keep his head. It was time to play the trump card. So one night in February, Julian and his inner circle got together for dinner and discussed how best to play this trump card. Of course, in Julian's later telling, everything that's about to happen was totally spontaneous and he was taken completely by surprise. But really, as you know by now, that's not really the way these things work. A few hours after the dinner broke up then, Julian was taken completely by surprise as the soldiers spontaneously surrounded his quarters and hailed him as Augustus. But Julian did not immediately appear, and instead let the word go round of what was happening at the imperial residence. The next morning, though, with the troops assembled and expectant, Julian stepped up onto the platform and announced that he could not in good conscience abide by Constantius's order. He would accept their acclamation, become Augustus, and fight for them if they would fight for him. The cheers were immediate and prolonged. Julian was hoisted up on a shield and carried about triumphantly. The revolt had begun. But Julian planned to play this thing carefully. He wrote a letter to Constantius explaining what had happened, that it was all outside of his control, and he even offered a compromise whereby Julian would reinforce the east with troops from Hispania. He even signed the letter Caesar so as to avoid offending the emperor unnecessarily. But when Constantius received the message, this small gesture was lost amidst the furious raging. As with the revolt of Magnentius, though, Constantius was locked down against the Sassanids, and he refused to abandon the east just to go deal with his treasonous Caesar. Again, as with the revolt of Magnentius, this is, I think, to Constantius's credit. All he could do then was send a sharp reply denouncing the actions of Julian and the Gallic army. But when Julian read that letter publicly, the imperial minister who had delivered it was forced to hightail it out of Paris at top speed, fearing for his life. The rest of 360 then passed with letters flying back and forth between the two now rival Augusti. Neither was looking for war. Julian because he was actually in a pretty weak position, and Constantius because of Shapur's continued belligerency. But neither would either back down. Julian asserted his independence, and Constantius denied it. So whether they wanted it or not, eventually war was going to come. So while the letters flew, both prepared. Julian secured the support of the British legions and then spent the year campaigning against the Germans to ensure that they would remain passive should he wind up marching east. Constantius, meanwhile, intensified his recruitment efforts while simultaneously looking to cut a deal with the Persians to temporarily suspend hostilities. It was not until early 361, though, a full year after Julian's elevation, that war truly became inevitable. As Julian fought a suddenly emboldened army of Alemanni, he captured communications that made it very clear that the Germans were being prompted to action by Constantius. This revelation, coupled with news that the war machine the emperor was assembling in the east was not necessarily being assembled to fight the Persians, led Julian to the conclusion that he had better act now or risk annihilation. By June of 361, Julian's mind was made up. He was going to go on the offensive. He gathered up 23,000 men, the most he felt he could spare, and then divided them into 3 columns. 2 of 10,000 men to be led by subordinates, and the last column of 3,000 to be led by Julian personally. These 3 columns then sped east along different routes, hoping to fly further under the radar and travel at a faster pace than one giant army would be able to do. Mostly the strategy worked, except for the fact that when Julian arrived at Sirmium, where everyone was supposed to link up, he was the only one there. With the Sirmium garrison alerted to Julian's offensive and his backup still en route, the rebel Augustus had to think fast. His solution was brilliant. A small detachment of soldiers snuck into the city and made their way to the commander's bedroom. Before anyone knew what had happened, the leader of the city was captured and snuck back into Julian's tent. Once there, the captured commander was told that Julian meant him no harm, but it was probably in his best interest to stand down Sirmium and allow Julian to take the city. The commander, with his back now personally against the wall, reluctantly agreed, and Julian entered Sirmium unopposed. Once the rest of his army showed up, Julian ordered the Sirmium legions redeployed to Gaul, where they were to keep an eye on the now weakly defended Rhine frontier. It seemed like a good idea in theory: neutralize a force whose loyalty could not be counted on, while simultaneously shoring up the rear. But the Sirmium troops were not the least bit happy about being sent to Gaul, and so while passing through northern Italy, they revolted and captured Aquileia. Okay, well, that's not good. With his military offensive going well, but not perfectly, Julian then went on the offensive politically, writing to the leadership of Rome and the various cities of Greece, defending his actions and denouncing Constantius. The only problem was that Constantius was actually wildly popular in Rome and the various Greek cities. Julian's overblown rhetoric rang false, and rather than ginning up support for his cause, the letters left him further isolated. As well as this adventure had begun, it was now starting to unravel. His aim had probably been to capture Constantinople before Constantius left the east. But then the real heavy news dropped. Constantius had made a deal with the Sassanids and was already marching west. Bottled up in the middle of the empire with his supply lines to Gaul cut off and political support non-existent, Julian was looking doomed. What he needed was a miracle. Then, in November of 361, a miracle. Constantius and his army had made it as far as the Cilician gates when the emperor came down sick. Unwilling to stop, he ordered the army to press on, but by the end of the next day, the shocking news began to spread. Constantius II was dead. He was 44 years old and had been in Augustus for 24 years. Following right on the heels of this shocking news was the even more shocking news that despite the fact that they were about to fight each other to the death, Julian was still listed in Constantius's will as the sole and rightful heir to the empire. So now, far from having to fight his way to Constantinople, the road to the capital was wide open. Julian, who had been raised a forgotten exile, was now the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Next week, we will see what he does now that he wields so much power. And I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with why we call him Julian the Apostate. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 145, Julian the Apostate. In November 361 AD, Constantius II died, and Julian, last of the Constantinians, inherited the empire. It would be an ironic end to the dynasty. At least, I'm pretty sure it's ironic. Sometimes I think that no situation actually fits the technical definition of irony, and that the word just sort of hangs out in the linguistic ether, singing a siren song that's designed to crash the unsuspecting against the jagged rocks of pedantry. But I'm pretty sure it's ironic. Constantine began the dynasty by single-handedly launching Christianity to prominence, and his nephew would end it by attempting to single-handedly turn back the clock and bury Christianity. That's ironic, right? It sure seems ironic, but it's probably just interesting. When Julian received word that his cousin was dead, I have to imagine that it took a few minutes for the news to sink in. Here he was, hunkered down in Thrace and ready to make what was very possibly shaping up to be his last stand, and instead, Constantius is dead, and I am now emperor. Like an approaching hurricane that just sort of transforms at the last moment into a pleasant sunny day, it takes a second to fully appreciate what the heck has just happened. But after the first few minutes of blinking wonder passed, Julian wasted no time completely embracing his imperial windfall. It appears that he had been thinking for a while about what he would do if he became emperor, because as soon as he became emperor, Julian jumped right into a completely out-of-left-field program of reform with both feet. Many critics of the new emperor note, though, that while his enthusiasm is laudable, maybe Julian should have looked before he leaped. Now the unopposed master of the empire, Julian entered Constantinople on December the 11th, 361 AD, and immediately got down to it. The first order of business, of course, was to completely overhaul the imperial court. Stalking the halls of the palace were men who were not just venal and corrupt, but men who had actively opposed Julian. Men who had consistently tried to talk Constantius into killing him. These men needed to be identified and purged. Aware that it might look bad if he just showed up and started arbitrarily killing people, Julian gave his purge the air of objectivity by appointing an independent commission of 6 trusted men to sort through the rolls and separate the good men from the bad men. The emperor even went so far as to situate this commission across the Sea of Marmara in the town of Chalcedon, so that the verdicts would not originate from the imperial palace itself. But I doubt that anyone was too fooled by this superficial independence. The worst of the emperor's enemies were executed, and the rest were exiled. It wasn't hard to see the invisible hand of Julian guiding the commission's decisions about who needed to go and who could stay. But beyond the strictly personnel decisions, the commission also included among the guilty men who were just plain old bad eggs. Constantius's court had a reputation for corruption, and the idealistic Julian appears to have been genuinely interested in purging the imperial rolls of the worst of the worst. But Julian was not done when the commission wrapped up its business. For all the attention his religious policies receive, religious policies that we'll get to in a minute, it is worth noting that Julian was not just trying to turn the clock back on the church. he was also trying to turn it back on the state. Julian clearly idolized the emperors of the Antonine dynasty and sought to base his own administration on their example. The first thing he attacked was just the sheer bloat of the imperial court. The Golden Age emperors had not needed 50 chefs and 30 secretaries and a personal barber, so why did he? Pink slips started flying through the palace, and anyone deemed unnecessary, redundant, or useless was simply given the boot. But firing all the leeches was just the beginning of Julian's attempt to turn back the clock to the hundreds AD. In a far more dramatic and far more disruptive move, the emperor also began to abandon the whole emperor as a living god conceit. He shed the massive smokescreen of officials standing between him and his subjects. He ate simple foods and wore simple clothes. He grew a philosopher's beard. Clearly, Julian wanted to pretend like the epoch-shifting reforms of Diocletian had never happened, and return to the princeps model of governance. In Julian's head, these were virtuous reforms that would be embraced by a public weary of overblown imperial egos. But mostly, the public was just bewildered. It would have been like Vespasian emerging from the civil wars of 69 AD and suddenly announcing that the Republic was back in effect. No one would have had any idea how to act, how to deal with it, or what was even expected of them. The entire political system of the late empire was centered around a quasi-divine emperor who inhabited the realm between man and God. To have an emperor suddenly joining in Senate debates, expressing emotion in public, and just sort of generally being around, well, it was massively disconcerting. Julian meant well, but his vision was hopelessly anachronistic. When he died, the mere mortals of the empire gratefully ran back into the paternal embrace of their once again quasi-divine emperor. While he was bringing the role of emperor back down to earth, Julian also attempted to reduce the public power of the imperial bureaucracy in general. Adopting a more Trajan-like worldview, Julian believed that the central government was there to focus on the big picture issues like defense and taxation. It was not there to micromanage the affairs of every city, town, hamlet, and farmhouse in the empire. Seeking to devolve political authority, Julian re-empowered the ruling councils of the cities and handed over jurisdiction of huge tracts of imperial land to these local magistrates. The idea was to get them involved in the decision-making process so Julian himself was not bogged down by endless minutiae. But once again, the citizens of the empire were more bewildered than anything else. Had Julian lived longer, this might all have eventually sunk in. But in the year and a half he ruled, he mostly just spun his wheels, trying to convince the leading men of various cities that being a magistrate wasn't just a massive financial burden anymore, that real power and real authority was theirs for the taking. They remained skeptical, though, until Julian's death ended the argument and the rich and powerful men of the empire continued their drift into rural feudalism undisturbed. To the energized 29-year-old emperor, however, these reforms were not yet doomed to failure, and he really felt like he was just getting started on a complete overhaul of the empire's political constitution. He had no way of knowing that because he was about to die, none of this was going to stick. We don't really have any idea what would have happened had Julian lived, and it is one of the great speculative questions of Roman history. Maybe the institutional barriers would have been too great to overcome in the end, but then again, maybe 30 years of Julian really would have been revolutionary. Which brings us to the heart and soul of Julian's short reign, the heart and soul of Julian the Apostate. As I mentioned 2 episodes back, Julian had secretly rejected Christianity around 350 AD, not long after being released from his Cappadocian exile. But until now, this rejection had been a behind closed doors sort of thing. Close friends and advisors were aware of Julian's religious preferences, But since there was no upside to publicizing these religious preferences, it was a secret that stayed with his close friends and advisors. Now that he was king of the hill, though, Julian was free to bring his paganism out into the open, and boy, did he ever bring it out into the open. From the minute he became emperor, Julian worked obsessively to tear down the socio-political influence of the Christians, or, as Julian liked to call them, the Galileans, a subtle dig based on a quote from the Gospel of John, that out of Galilee ariseth no prophet. But Julian knew that merely tearing down would not be sufficient to fulfill his vision of a re-paganized empire. He would also have to build something up to replace the soon-to-be displaced Christians. When Julian entered Constantinople in December of 361, he immediately began this dual program of tearing down Christianity and building up paganism. It goes without saying that the political purge that accompanied Julian's arrival in the capital was driven in part by religious motives. In other words, the Christians were to be kicked out of influential posts, denied access to the imperial purse strings, and denied access to the emperor personally. Since the previous regime of Constantius had been so overtly Christian, though, this basically meant getting rid of everyone, something even Julian found he couldn't bring himself to do. So the apostate emperor wound up retaining a handful of the most honest and capable Christians in his administration. Beyond these token few, though, if you were Christian, your civil service career was suddenly in jeopardy. Now, of course, the swiftness with which Julian was able to reorganize the inner circle of the imperial government could not be matched on a system-wide basis. The bureaucracy was simply too large and too dispersed to overhaul overnight. But Julian was taking the long view on this thing, and so he promulgated a discriminatory order that when jobs opened up, the God-fearing candidates, that is, pagans, were to be preferred over the atheists, that is, the Christians. For the ambitious civil servant, this had to be a frustrating development. Like a week ago, they told me I had to be Christian if I wanted this job, and now you're telling me that because I'm a Christian, I'm not going to get the job? I don't really care one way or the other. I just wish you guys would get your story straight. On the building up front, Julian turned his attention first to building up in the literal sense. He ordered all the old shrines and temples and sanctuaries that had been closed over the years to be reopened, and appropriated imperial funds to help defray the costs. But, knowing that the central government would not be able to afford to cover even a fraction of the total costs that this order would generate, Julian issued an addendum edict that was one part practical and one part punitive. Under the previous Christian regimes, citizens had been encouraged to destroy the blasphemous sanctuaries of the pagans, or at the very least, to repurpose them into something more useful. So all these old pagan buildings became shops and warehouses, and in some cases, family apartments. Julian ordered that the men responsible for the destruction or repurposing of the temples be responsible for the costs of undoing the damage they had done. Even Julian's most ardent admirers are troubled by the real-world effects of this edict. The empire had been Christian for 40 years now, so in many cases, families and businesses had absorbed the old pagan holy places a really long time ago. Their lives and livelihoods had become tied, at imperial encouragement no less, to the discarded husks of what they had been assured were dead cults. Now, suddenly, Julian wanted to kick them out and make them pay to rebuild the houses of said dead cults. It was unfair in theory and cruel in practice. But Julian pushed on undeterred, and in February of 362, about 4 months after donning the purple, he issued his famous, or infamous, depending on who you talk to, Edict on Religious Tolerance. The point of the edict was to officially overturn the anti-pagan laws that had been on the books since the reign of Constantine. Now, those laws which banned sacrifice had never been uniformly or even diligently enforced, but still, officially they were out there, and so Julian officially canceled them. Using the same sort of language Constantine had once used himself in the Edict of Milan, Julian declared that all religions were now to be considered equal in the eyes of the government. This meant that all the secret pagans or lapsed pagans or whoever could now return to their old ways without fear of state sanction. It also meant, though, that Christianity was not illegal. Given everything we know about Julian the Apostate, one might assume that the first thing he did was ban the Galilean religion outright. But his plans were a bit more subtle, a bit more long-term, and a bit more rational than his name might imply. The utter failure of the Great Persecution was not exactly ancient history. Julian knew that, far from breaking the Christians, that violent repression only led to a hardening of their resolve. So his edict was designed to unleash upon them their very worst and most hated enemy in all the world: other Christians. Julian's Edict of Toleration meant that the 40-year-old policy of using imperial muscle to back up what, for lack of a better word, I'll call mainstream Christianity, was over. All those repressed heresies were now free to come out of the woodwork and preach their own particular brand of the one true faith. Just at the moment when the Christian community needed to unite in the face of Julian's attacks, its ranks were sowed with discord. In Julian's perfect world, he would never have to do anything so dramatic as destroy Christianity. Instead, they would just slowly but surely tear themselves apart. Probably the nicest thing about this toleration strategy was that it enabled Julian to maintain the moral high ground. He pointedly declared that no religious violence would be accepted, no matter who the perpetrator or who the victim. Pagans were not to attack Christians. Christians were not to attack pagans, and Christians were not to attack each other. Thus, Julian was able to avoid being painted as some monster a la Galerius or Maximinus Daia. Because I just want everyone to get along. What's wrong with everyone getting along? Come on, can't we all just get along? But just because he encouraged non-violent means of achieving his goal, that did not mean that Julian's goal was not to drive Christianity into the ground. His goal, most definitely, was to drive Christianity into the ground. In May of 362, Julian left Constantinople and headed for Antioch. Since he had originally established his bona fides in the west, it was important for the new emperor to reach out to the eastern provinces and consolidate his rule over the whole empire. The East, after all, had been Constantius's domain for almost a quarter of a century, and Julian had come to power in the middle of a revolt against the man the eastern provincials had happily called Augustus all those years. In other words, Julian had some making up to do. On top of this political rationale, Julian also had a military rationale for heading east. The war with the Persians that Constantius had broken off was still hanging out there unresolved, and Julian wanted to use that war to cement his imperial authority. A big win over the Persians would catapult him to a whole new level. Not only would he earn the respect of the Eastern legions, who had just months before been marching out to crush him, but he would also establish himself as a military leader of unparalleled skill. He could already point to major victories in the west, add major victories in the east, and boy, he might just become bigger than Constantine. On the road to Antioch, Julian issued another one of his famous/infamous anti-Christian edicts. Henceforth, Christians would not be allowed to teach children using any of the classical texts. That meant no Homer, no Cicero, no Plato. But of course, the basic curriculum of Roman education, philosophy and grammar and rhetoric, used all of those works as their standard textbooks. If you can't teach Homer, you can't teach grammar. It's just that simple. The edict thus presented the parents of the empire with a stark choice. Their kids could either be taught by Christian teachers, but be denied the standard education, or they could be given the standard education and be denied any Christian interpretation of the material. Since a classical education was still required if you wanted to have any sort of decent career, Julian was banking that the vast majority of parents would choose to abandon Christian teachers rather than have their children grow up not knowing who Achilles was. To put this another way, Julian passed a law essentially strangling off Christian access to impressionable young minds. Like I say, he wanted to drive Christianity into the ground. When he arrived in Antioch in July of 362, though, Julian finally ran into some pushback to all this. He came into the eastern capital under the mistaken assumption that the city was eager to shed its Christian veneer and return to its pagan roots. But that was really not the case, as the fracas over the nearby Temple of Apollo would make abundantly clear. Julian went to visit the famous temple shortly after his arrival, and was dismayed at the dilapidated condition he found it in. When he ordered a priest to join him at the site for a sacrifice, he was further incensed to see the disinterested priest wandering up with a leftover goose to offer Apollo, rather than a nice fat bull. Julian then consulted the oracle of the temple in order to gain some much-needed mystical advice, but was told that as long as the dead were desecrating the temple grounds, that the oracle could not speak. In this case, the dead referred to a famous Christian martyr who had been buried near the temple grounds. Julian figured it would be no big deal to exhume the body and then move it back to a proper cemetery, but the citizens of Antioch were outraged at this sacrilege. They came out en masse to protest the emperor's decision, and then, just a few days later, the Temple of Apollo mysteriously burned down. The verdict of history is that the fire was probably an accident, caused when some lit candles were neglected. But the verdict of Julian was that the Christians of Antioch were guilty of arson. All of this growing enmity was further exacerbated by another bout of famine, just like the one that had helped take down Julian's brother Gallus. The emperor attempted to set price controls on the now scarce grain supply, but all that happened was that rich merchants bought up all the available food at the controlled price and then carted it off to the surrounding countryside, where they sold it at an insane markup. Between the religious conflict, the famine, and the just downright incompatibility of Julian and the Antiochians, they liked sumptuous living and games, he liked plain living and philosophy, it soon became clear that this was a relationship that was just never going to work. At a set of games thrown by Julian, against his will of course, the Antiochians went in for a particularly harsh round of heckling that left the emperor embarrassed and embittered. He responded by publicly disseminating a satirical work called The Beard Hater, in which he viciously lampooned the citizens of Antioch while pretending to make fun of himself. No one really comes off well in the exchange, and the final upshot of it all is that when the emperor finally left the city in March 363, he promised never to return. His encounter with the Antiochians, though, did not cause him to reassess his religious policies, so much as cause him to dig in his heels. In January of 363, Christians were banned from practicing law. In February, the Christian custom of daytime funerals was prohibited. But as I said, Julian was not just about tearing down. In the middle of all this, he also made an energetic, if futile, attempt to unify all the various pagan cults into a single organized religion, something that could structurally compete with Christianity. Julian could see how the empire-wide network of Christians helped cement its place in the hearts and minds of the citizens, how their dedication to helping the poor, tending to the sick, and offering sanctuary to the lost made them so popular with the common people. And most of all, how their unity, despite their many differences, made them an institutional force to be reckoned with. So Julian tried to create a pagan alternative to the Christian church. According to his plans, high priests would act as bishops, lower priests would act as presbyters and deacons, and social outreach would become a central part of everyone's religious duties. The emperor even made a hurried stab at creating an overarching metaphysical, philosophical framework for all these cults to live in together. But it was a hopeless cause, because, first of all, the emperor did not have time to properly flesh out his ideas. Second, maybe he didn't have the intellectual chops to even pull it off had he had the time. And third, was a position paper really going to suddenly bind together religious cults that had never had anything to do with each other? There was no such thing as capital P paganism. It's just a word that we use to describe a collection of practices and traditions that had all built up independently of each other over time. You can't just throw them all together and say, now you're just one thing. Julian wanted the final fight to be a one-on-one affair, Christianity versus traditional polytheism. But the very nature of that polytheism precluded the emperor's vision from ever becoming a reality. It was always going to be Christianity versus a whole bunch of small, disunited cults. But whether it would have worked or not doesn't really matter. When I say Julian did not have the time to properly flesh out his ideas, I don't just mean that he was really busy and didn't have time to focus on philosophy. As I'm sure you know, Julian is about to die and leave all of this work unfinished. However, it would not be his war with Christianity that would bring him down, but rather his far more mundane and worldly war with Persia. Next week, the emperor will take to the field ready to score a victory against the Sassanids. But unfortunately, beyond score a victory, he didn't seem to have much strategic direction. What would a victory even look like? Did he want to sack the capital? Beat Shapur in a big battle? Remove Shapur from power completely? Conquer the whole of Persia? What? No one really knew what the ultimate objective was, and it may have been the case that Julian himself did not even know what the ultimate objective was. The emperor liked to jump into things with both feet, and once again, it appears that he really should have looked before he leaped. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 146, The Spear of Destiny. Last week, we covered the wide range of reforms Julian initiated after becoming emperor. Though he is usually remembered as the man who tried to stem the tide of Christianity, we should not forget that he was interested in more than just religion. And given enough time, it is possible that we could have been sitting here talking about Julian as a major transformative figure. But instead, we talk about him merely as a brief detour, an accidental left turn, noticed and corrected within a block of the mistake. This week, we will get into why Julian's imperial course correction never got the empire further down his pagan principate side road. In the end, it wasn't because of institutional barriers, entrenched interests, or even the irresistible destiny of Christianity. It was because of a forgotten breastplate and an anonymously thrown spear. After a frustrating winter spent butting heads with the citizens of Antioch, Julian was eager to leave behind the aggravating belligerency of his fellow citizens and focus his attention on a much easier enemy to grapple with, the Sassanids. He didn't have to worry about placating the Sassanids or making friends with the Sassanids or even caring what the Sassanids thought about his reform agenda. He just needed to beat the crap out of the Sassanids. I imagine that as much as Julian was looking forward to the political bounce he would get from a successful campaign in the East, that he was also looking forward to the cathartic relief he would get from a good, hard fight. Much to Julian's consternation, however, the Sassanids were presently trying to duck that fight. The Persian king Shapur II spent most of his epic reign, which was an amazing 70 years long, vacillating between aggression and pacifism towards Rome, and it appears that with the death of his old enemy Constantius II, that the king was ready to once again enter one of his passive phases. His recent victories, which had included the sack of Amida, had turned out to have been of the Pyrrhic variety. That is, the costs of the campaign far outweighed the benefits. Further fighting at this point would probably only shift the border between Rome and Persia a few yards in either direction. So what was the point? Shapur reached out to Julian and tried to work out a peace agreement that would satisfy both leaders, but Julian was not having it. He had come east to make war on the Sassanids, not to make peace with the Sassanids. Though the terms were reasonable, and it is hard to see how rejecting them benefited Rome in the final analysis, Julian had designed a game plan to take him through the early years of his reign, and that game plan said very clearly, win a great victory against Persia. So Julian refused to listen to terms. If I make peace, I won't be able to win a great victory against Persia, and it says very clearly right here that I need to win a great victory against Persia. You get the feeling like Shapur could have offered control of the whole Sassanid Empire and promised to become the emperor's private footstool, and Julian still would have demanded a war. So in March of 363, Julian left Antioch at the head of an army, telling those lousy ingrate Antiochians on his way out the door that he was never, ever coming back. Though the estimates for the size of Julian's army vary from a low of 65,000 to a high of 90,000, there is one thing we can be sure of. Julian was mustering every available soldier he could get his hands on. He even demanded that the king of Armenia send an auxiliary army to help shore up the Roman ranks. Julian wanted nothing less than a total, complete, and overwhelming victory, and he did not want to leave anything to chance. However, though an army the size of Julian's eastern invasion force, whatever size it actually was, would have made the emperor an unstoppable juggernaut back in Gaul, out here in Syria, it made him merely equal to the task. By most estimates, the army Shapur had in the field was able to match the Romans man for man. When you throw in the fact that most of the soldiers in the Roman army were either recently recruited or had been transferred over from the west and were unused to desert fighting, well, even 100,000 men might not have been equal to the task. In other words, Julian might have thought he wasn't leaving anything to chance, but he was still going to need a healthy dose of luck to pull this thing off. Beyond questions about whether his army could do what Julian wanted them to do, the emperor is often criticized for marching east without a clear strategic aim beyond victory for victory's sake. Sadly, for the men of the Roman army, though, no one realized quite how rudderless this war actually was in the beginning, because Julian appeared to have a very clear idea of what he was doing. He was going to attack the Sassanid capital of Ctesiphon. To pull this off, the emperor knew that he would need to keep Shapur off his back for a little while. The Persian king was up in the north near the Armenian border with the bulk of his veteran army, and that is exactly where Julian wanted him to stay. To keep Shapur in place, Julian peeled off 20 to 30,000 of his men, the variation depending on how large you think his overall army was, and sent them to feign an attack on Medea. The emperor hoped that in the fog of war, this decoy invasion force would be taken for the main invasion force, and confound Shapur's reaction time accordingly. Even if the king saw through the Medea feint, Julian reckoned that Shapur would, at the very least, assume the Romans would be taking the easy route down the Tigris to attack Ctesiphon, and so, while the decoy army marched northeast, Julian himself chose the tougher, but less expected route down the Euphrates. Despite his lack of a coherent strategy, Julian did not neglect his logistical responsibilities, and after reaching the Euphrates, he rendezvoused with a fleet of some 1,000 ships that he had ordered constructed to keep the food and munitions flowing. With his years in Gaul marked by constant supply problems, Julian was making damn sure that he would not have to worry about some latter-day Barbatio seizing his grain and burning his supply transports. The preparations were complete by early April, and Julian spent the next month methodically making his way south towards the Sassanid capital. As the Romans marched, they seized control of any cities or military outposts they happened by. Since the majority of these were only lightly garrisoned, the resistance they met during these first few weeks was sporadic and short-lived. It wasn't until they were closing in on Ctesiphon that Julian and his army finally ran into some real pushback. 2 cities in a row shut up their gates and attempted to resist, and though in both cases the Romans won after a quick, hard battle, the fights did lay bare the realities of siege warfare in the desert heat. As the Roman army neared Ctesiphon, the big question became how to get his men and his 1,000 ships over to the capital. You see, part of the reason the approach along the Tigris was easier was because Ctesiphon is actually located on the Tigris. Having tens of thousands of soldiers and 1,000 supply ships doesn't do you much good if you're, on the complete wrong river. The obvious answer was to take the long way around. That is, head down to the confluence of the rivers and then turn around and row upstream. But that route was arduous and fraught with danger, and Julian had no intention of exposing his army if he didn't have to. And he was pretty sure that he didn't have to. You see, Julian knew a little secret that had been lost to the ages. Once upon a time, the kings of Persia had built a canal connecting the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But due to excessive flooding, the canal had long ago been blocked up, and now sat around as an innocuous dry ditch. Julian located this royal canal, and had his men knock out the dam that kept the long-forgotten channel dry. Just like that, the Romans had a straight path from here to there. Thus, in mid-May of 363, the Sassanid garrison defending Ctesiphon was dismayed to discover a massive Roman invasion fleet descending on them not from the north or from the south, where attacks were to be expected, but from the west, which, wait, what? With Shapur stalled, but by this point no longer completely fooled, by the decoy army in the north, the soldiers defending Ctesiphon were also dismayed to learn that they were on their own. At this point, Julian had to have been delighted by his prospects, and even more delighted by the result of the initial encounter between his men and the Ctesiphon garrison. The Persians lined up for battle in front of the city, but rather than attack them directly, Julian spent the day lulling them into a false sense of security by making a big show of settling in and not paying much attention to the opposing army. But as soon as night fell, Julian ordered a surprise attack. The resulting battle lasted well into the next day, and eventually the Sassanids were pushed back into the city. But critically, the Romans did not immediately follow up this success, and they retired before capturing the city in one fell swoop. Which is unfortunate, because that day's battle would prove to be the high point of Julian's invasion. From that moment on, it was pretty much all downhill. The first thing that struck the Roman officers the next morning, and the first thing that makes us think that perhaps Julian had not thought this through fully, was the impressive defensive fortifications Ctesiphon now boasted. You'll recall from past episodes that sacking Ctesiphon was practically a rite of passage for Roman emperors there for a while. And really, all they had to do was show up and the city would surrender. But the advanced fortification techniques that had begun cropping up at the end of the 3rd century were not a strictly Roman phenomenon. Even with his full army, and he was still waiting for the decoy army to rejoin his main force, it would take time and effort to dislodge the Sassanids now that they were settling in for a siege. More to the point, the Romans would probably be unable to take the city before Shapur arrived with the main Persian army. And even if Shapur took his time getting to Ctesiphon, the royal canal, the one that had been closed because of excessive flooding, well, it was now flooding and creating a malaria-ridden swamp for the Romans to camp in. So, where did that leave them? What was the plan now? Initially, Julian argued in favor of launching the siege anyway, but in the command tent, he was pummeled by a nearly unanimous officer corps that told him in no uncertain terms that, in their professional opinion, a siege would be suicide. Finally, Julian relented and agreed to call off the assault. So, okay, now that that's settled, what's the new plan? Sacking Ctesiphon would have been nice, but what was the greater purpose it would have served? It's clear we need to change our approach, so what's our overarching strategic goal? Maybe we can rejigger our methods and achieve the same result? Are we trying to conquer Persia? Are we trying to remove Shapur from power? Are we simply trying to force him to give us a better peace deal? What are we doing out here? Though we do not have a solid record of these meetings, it appears that Julian did not really have answers to these questions. Sacking Ctesiphon had likely been an end unto itself. Now that he had run into a wall, literally a big, thick wall, Julian wasn't sure what to do. He was going to have to improvise his way out of this, and the plan he came up with was pretty clearly not in the original playbook. Going back the way that they had come would have been too difficult, so the emperor decided to lead his army up the Tigris River, which was the quickest route back to Armenia and back to safety. The Roman soldiers were understandably skeptical of this plan,